On a warm summer afternoon, the air in a small-town playground carried the sounds of children laughing, shoes scuffing over gravel, and swings squeaking back and forth in steady rhythm. Two sisters, just 3 and 5 years old, played at the heart of it all. The older one pushed her sister on the swing, their giggles rising and falling in the same cadence as the chains. Their mother sat nearby on a worn bench, her eyes fixed on them with the kind of constant awareness only a parent has. It was a day like any other, a routine stop after errands, a reward for good behavior, the kind of outing where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. When her phone buzzed, the mother hesitated for only a moment. It was a call she had been waiting for, and she believed she could keep one eye on the playground while answering. It was supposed to be harmless, just a minute or two. She turned slightly away, lowering her voice, still listening for the girls' laughter. But as the call stretched on, the voices of her daughters seemed to fade beneath the chatter of other families. And when she turned back, the swings that had been full only moments before now moved on their own. One swayed slightly in the breeze, the other hung perfectly still. At first, she thought maybe they had run toward the slides or had spotted friends and darted off. She called their names, her voice cutting through the noise. But there was no answer. Parents nearby glanced up, assuming it was the usual call to restless kids. But as seconds passed, her tone sharpened. She shouted again, louder, scanning every corner of the park. Her phone slipped from her hand into the grass. The casual atmosphere of the playground shifted in an instant. Mothers gathered their own children closer. A father dropped his coffee and began to look around the perimeter. The quiet panic of the first realization spread outward like a shockwave. Within minutes, the mother was on her knees, checking behind bushes, peering under the slide, her voice breaking as she called. The girls were nowhere in sight. The park was not large, and the edges were open, bordered by a street, a row of houses, and a thin fence that separated the grounds from a stretch of woods. To the mother, it felt impossible that in the time it took to answer a call, her daughters could vanish. But they had. A bystander dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice on the line did little to match the urgency on the ground. The mother's words tumbled out frantically, describing what her daughters were wearing, how young they were, how this wasn't possible. Within 10 minutes, squad cars rolled in. Officers moved swiftly, speaking with parents, trying to establish a last confirmed sighting. Witnesses remembered seeing the sisters only minutes before. One recalled the older girl still laughing on the swing. Another thought they had spotted the younger one running toward the sandbox, but no one could say for sure when they had disappeared. The beat or officers expanded outward, searching the parking lot, the bathrooms, the tree line. They called for backup, for canine units. The sound of sirens now carried across the neighborhood. A helicopter request was placed before the first hour passed. What had begun as a lazy afternoon was now a scene gripped by dread, flashing lights, and the heavy silence of disbelief. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the noise. Some joined the search, checking under porches and in backyards. Others gathered in small clusters, whispering, the horror of what was happening sinking in. This was not a sprawling city where crime was expected. This was the kind of place where families left doors unlocked, where children roamed freely in daylight, where the biggest worries were scraped knees or broken arms. The idea that two little girls could vanish in seconds felt unthinkable. The mother's anguish grew louder as the minutes dragged on. Officers tried to steady her, to gather information, but her mind could barely focus. Every detail she gave seemed irrelevant compared to the reality. Her children were gone, and the last time she saw them, they were laughing, alive, right in front of her. That image clashed violently with the emptiness now. As daylight began to tilt toward late afternoon, the playground was no longer a place of joy. It had become a search grid, its perimeter taped off, officers walking in patterns, parents holding their children closer than ever. Every swing, every slide, every corner of the sandbox was checked again and again, as though the girls could somehow reappear if looked at from a different angle. The first hours of any missing child case are the most critical, and the officers knew it. But the longer the search continued without progress, the more unlikely a swift recovery seemed. The crowd of neighbors, parents, and police moved with growing urgency. every rustle in the trees drawing attention, every car that slowed by the lot watched with suspicion. Fear took hold, not just of the mother, but of the entire town. By sunset, the once bright playground stood in the glare of floodlights brought in by authorities. The swings no longer held children, but remained as silent reminders of how quickly innocence had been stolen. The image of them moving in the wind stayed etched in the minds of everyone who saw them, a chilling symbol of what had slipped away. And as the night settled over the town, the reality of the situation became undeniable. 2 toddler sisters had vanished from a playground in broad daylight, and no one could explain how. Within minutes of the frantic 911 call, the quiet suburban playground transformed into the center of a desperate search. Patrol cars raced into the lot, their sirens cutting across the small-town streets, lights flashing against the rows of family homes. Officers moved quickly, establishing a perimeter and ordering parents and children to remain in place until they could be questioned. Yellow tape stretched across the edges of the park, a jarring sight that seemed at odds with the swings and slides behind it. What had once been an ordinary summer afternoon had now hardened into something unthinkable, and everyone present could feel it. The first officers on scene spoke directly with the mother, who could barely string her sentences together through sobs. She described what her daughters had been wearing, their names, and the exact time she had last seen them. The officers wrote furiously in their notepads, repeating the questions more than once to be certain. Around them, other parents whispered their own recollections. One insisted the older girl was still on the swing just minutes earlier. Another thought they had seen both children walking toward the sandbox. But when pressed for precise details, what time, what direction, who else was nearby, the answers began to blur and contradict each other. What seemed certain at first quickly dissolved into uncertainty, and investigators knew how damaging that could be in the critical first hours. A call went out for additional units, for canine handlers, and for state police support. Officers fanned outward in coordinated sweeps, checking bathrooms, vehicles in the parking lot, and the small thickets of trees surrounding the park. The neighborhood, usually so familiar, now appeared vast and filled with possibility. Every unlocked shed, every backyard gate, every car with tinted windows became a place that needed to be checked. Parents clutched their children tightly, some weeping as they were escorted out of the taped perimeter, unable to believe that 2 toddlers could vanish in daylight surrounded by witnesses. When the canine teams arrived, officers handed them shoes taken from the family's car to give the dogs a scent trail. The handlers commanded the animals to search, and all eyes followed as the dogs darted toward the swings, noses low to the ground. For a brief moment, hope surged. Perhaps they would find a clear path, a direction to follow. The dogs sniffed around the playground, then pulled toward the back fence that separated the park from a stretch of woods. They circled, barked, and seemed agitated. But just as quickly as the trail began, it ended. Handlers tried again, leading the dogs along the fence line, but each attempt yielded the same result. The trail stopped cold at the edge of the playground, as though the girls had vanished into thin air. Investigators knew this likely meant one of 2 things. Either the children had been lifted into a vehicle nearby, cutting the scent, or the ground had been too heavily trampled by searchers and parents to preserve the trail. Neither explanation brought comfort. Both carried the weight of dread. Witness statements soon introduced another layer of confusion. A man near the parking lot had drawn attention in the minutes before the disappearance. Some claimed he was tall, in a dark jacket despite the heat. Others remembered him in a baseball cap and jeans. A few swore they had seen no man at all, only families and children. The descriptions clashed, leaving detectives with more questions than answers. They canvassed the lot, searching for tire marks or signs of a rushed departure, but the afternoon traffic had already muddied the pavement with countless comings and goings. As evening drew closer, helicopters were requested to scan the area. Their rotors thundered above, lights sweeping over rooftops and fields. But nothing unusual appeared. Officers knocked on doors in the neighborhood, asking residents to check sheds, garages, and basements. Some neighbors opened their homes willingly. Others hesitated, rattled by the implication that a kidnapper could be hiding among them. The community, usually bound by trust, now pulsed with suspicion. Inside the taped-off playground, the mother sat trembling against the bench where she had last watched her daughters. Officers tried to comfort her, but she could not be consoled. The sight of the swings, empty, still swaying lightly, was unbearable. She replayed the moment again and again in her mind. The brief distraction of the phone call, the sound of her daughters laughing, the split second she looked away. Now she sat in the silence that had replaced it all. The first hours dragged on, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. The more time passed, the steeper the odds became of finding the girls quickly and alive. Detectives knew this, and their urgency deepened with every fruitless sweep. A command post was set up at the edge of the park, maps spread out on folding tables, assignments handed out over radios. Volunteers gathered in groups, some locals arriving still in work uniforms, ready to join the search. But as darkness began to fall, the reality settled heavily on everyone present. The dogs had lost the scent. Witnesses contradicted one another. No items of clothing, no toys. No trace of the girls had been found. The swings now stood frozen in place, the playground surrounded by flashing lights. What had begun as a hopeful, frantic search was already taking on the darker tones of something else, a disappearance that no one could yet explain. Detectives wasted no time drawing up a list of possible suspects, narrowing their focus on the men in town who were already flagged in law enforcement databases. The first sweep was predictable: registered offenders within a 10-mile radius. Their addresses were printed out, their photographs spread across the desks at the makeshift command post. Officers were dispatched to knock on doors, to ask where each man had been during those critical hours. Alibis trickled in, some shaky, others backed by co-workers or surveillance cameras from local businesses. But as the night wore on, one name began to circulate more than the others: a handyman who was known to loiter around the park when he had no business there. Parents had noticed him before, standing off to the side while children played, smoking or tinkering with tools from the back of his truck. No one had ever reported him, but they had remembered. Detectives tracked him down the following morning. He was calm, maybe too calm, as he answered their questions. He claimed he had been on a roofing job 2 towns over, working until sundown. His employer vouched for him, though the timeline had small gaps. He owned an older pickup truck, the kind that could have easily slipped in and out of the park's lot without anyone remembering. When officers requested to search the vehicle, he consented without hesitation. Inside, they found ropes, tools, and tarps, items that could look sinister under the wrong lens, though entirely normal for his trade. Nothing tied directly to the sisters. Word of his questioning spread quickly. By the end of the day, neighbors were whispering about him in grocery aisles and at church gatherings. Parents traded uneasy stories of moments when they had seen him watching from the shade of a tree or standing by the fence, never interacting but always present. Fear and suspicion tightened its grip around the community. If he wasn't guilty, then who was? And if he was innocent, why had no one ever stopped to question why a grown man lingered near a playground alone? Investigators knew the danger of letting rumor dictate the case, but the pressure was immense. Parents demanded answers, local media pushed daily updates, and tips poured in through hotlines. Each one had to be logged, verified, and chased. Some were as vague as a suspicious van near the highway, others more pointed: claims that the handyman had once stared too long at someone's daughter, or that another man in town kept locks on his basement doors. The flood of accusations pulled detectives in multiple directions, none of them yielding solid evidence. Meanwhile, the girl's mother and father were forced to endure the scrutiny of a different kind. Detectives had to rule out every possibility, which meant confirming their alibis, searching their home, and examining their relationships. Relatives were brought in for interviews. The parents complied, but the shadow of suspicion clung to them, made worse by whispers from townsfolk who wondered aloud if the abduction had been staged or if the answer lay inside the family. It was a painful, humiliating layer on top of their already unbearable grief. Despite the lack of breakthroughs, detectives kept circling back to the handyman. They brought him in twice more, combed through his work records, even staked out his home. But every time they closed in, the details seemed to unravel. His employer confirmed his presence on site, co-workers described seeing him carrying materials during the hours in question, and time cards matched. The gaps investigators wanted to exploit never fully opened into evidence. The frustration was palpable. As weeks passed without resolution, the town's fear hardened into paranoia. Every stranger was eyed with suspicion. Every unfamiliar car tracked as it rolled through the neighborhood. Parents no longer let their children play outside alone. The playground itself, once the heart of the community, stood empty. Its swings motionless, its slides gathering dust. Where laughter had once rung out, silence now reigned, broken only by the creak of chains in the wind. Detectives expanded their net. They interviewed seasonal workers, drifters who had passed through, even teenagers with records of petty crime. They ran background checks, cross-referenced vehicles, and scrutinized surveillance footage from gas stations and highway cameras. Still, nothing concrete emerged. The case grew colder with each passing day, but inside the community, suspicion only deepened. Parents began to wonder if the abductor wasn't an outsider at all, but one of their own. A neighbor, a trusted face, someone who had blended seamlessly into the crowd on that summer afternoon. The lack of answers left scars. Some families pulled their children from local schools, seeking safety elsewhere. Others withdrew inward, building fences, installing locks, avoiding the community they had once embraced. The handyman eventually moved away under the weight of suspicion, his name never cleared, but never proven guilty. His departure left behind only more questions. Detectives kept the case file thick with interviews and leads, but in truth, momentum was slipping. They had suspects, but no charges, theories, but no evidence. And with every passing week, the haunting reality grew clearer. 2 sisters had vanished in broad daylight, and no one could agree on who had taken them or why. The trail was cooling, and what had once seemed like a solvable case was already drifting toward the unknown. In the days that followed the disappearance, the small-town playground became the nucleus of a massive search operation. By the second morning, helicopters hovered over open fields, their blades chopping the quiet into fragments as searchlights swept across farmland and rooftops. Officers stood at roadblocks, stopping vehicles, peering into the back seats of cars, scanning license plates against registries. The urgency was clear. The first 72 hours were critical, and they were slipping away. On the ground, hundreds of volunteers assembled. They came from nearby towns, workplaces, and churches, carrying flashlights, bottled water, and makeshift walking sticks. Search coordinators divided them into grids, sending lines of people into the woods with instructions to move slowly, to look under every log, inside every hollow tree, behind every outbuilding. The woods, so familiar to locals, now felt menacing, every rustle, every shadow a possible clue. Yet despite the sheer number of eyes, the forest gave nothing back. Creeks and drainage ditches were next. Divers in wetsuits lowered themselves into the murky water, combing the bottom inch by inch. Officers walked banksides, using poles to probe for small bodies, for clothing, for toys that might have been dropped in panic. The silence, each time they emerged from the water empty-handed, grew heavier, pressing against the volunteers who watched. Hope remained at first, fragile but real. Parents told themselves the girls might still be alive, maybe hidden, maybe taken by someone who wanted them cared for. Detectives pushed on with theories, piecing together possibilities. Abduction seemed most likely, the suddenness of the disappearance, the absence of physical evidence. But if someone had taken them, how had they done so without anyone noticing? Others floated the idea of trafficking, a theory that made the case feel bigger, darker, stretching beyond the borders of the town into a network of faceless strangers. Another theory suggested an accident. Perhaps the girls had wandered off and fallen into water or been trapped somewhere unseen. But each search came up empty, stripping away the thin comfort those theories provided. The days turned to a week, then 2. Volunteers grew weary, their numbers thinning as they returned to jobs and families. Still, the core group pressed on, combing through brush, double-checking abandoned barns, knocking on doors again and again. Flyers with the sisters' faces, both smiling and bright-eyed, papered telephone poles, gas stations, and grocery store windows. The images became unavoidable, a reminder that 2 lives were still missing and no answers had been found. Detectives knew how crucial physical evidence would be. A shoe, a piece of clothing, a discarded toy, anything to point toward what had happened. But not a single trace surfaced, no footprints in the mud, no scraps of fabric snagged on branches. It was as if the girls had stepped off the swings and dissolved into thin air. The absence of evidence was more terrifying than anything they could uncover, for it meant there was no trail to follow, no starting point to build from. At night, when the searchers went home, the playground sat empty under floodlights left by investigators. The swings barely moved in the wind, but their stillness carried a weight of its own. Officers kept watch, guarding the area, but it gave them no new answers. Families driving past slowed down, staring out windows at the taped perimeter, the place where 2 children had last been seen. The silence of the park became its own cruel echo, a daily reminder of the unsolved. Inside the investigation room, detectives argued over what direction to take. Some pushed to pursue the trafficking angle harder, reaching out to federal agencies for possible connections. Others insisted the answer was still local, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. Files stacked higher, tips logged and dismissed, each dead end carving deeper into morale. The case was active, but already it felt like it was slipping into the cracks of uncertainty. The community clung to vigils, holding. Candles near the swings, praying for a break, for any sign the girls might still be alive. But behind the prayers and the hopeful posters, doubt began to creep in. Each passing day without discovery chipped away at the belief in a safe return. It was a silent, unspoken truth few wanted to admit out loud. Hope was fading. And with every unanswered question, the playground became not just a place of childhood joy, but the scene of a mystery that none of them could understand. In nearly every missing child case, when the search turns up nothing, the circle of suspicion inevitably draws inward. After weeks of fruitless leads, investigators began scrutinizing the family itself. The mother, who had first reported the disappearance, was asked to recount her actions over and over. Detectives pressed her for the exact length of the phone call, who she had been speaking to, whether her eyes had strayed from the playground for seconds or minutes. Each retelling was compared against phone records, timestamps, and witness accounts. The more her story was dissected, the more it seemed investigators were less interested in searching the woods than in examining her every word. The father's alibi was subjected to the same pressure. He had been at work the day the girls vanished, clocked in at a construction site 20 miles away. At first, it seemed airtight. Co-workers remembered him pouring concrete in the morning sun. But gaps emerged, moments when he might have stepped away, the absence of precise surveillance footage to pin down his whereabouts minute by minute. Detectives asked whether he could have left unnoticed, whether he had left at all. Rumors followed quickly. Perhaps he had been angry, perhaps the marriage was strained, perhaps there were secrets inside the home that neighbors had never seen. Relatives weren't spared either. Grandparents, siblings, cousins, all were summoned to the station for questioning. Each endured hours of interrogation, asked about family conflicts, financial strains, private arguments. Some sat through polygraph examinations, wires strapped to their bodies, their nerves tested as much as their words. While no evidence emerged to implicate anyone, the process itself left wounds. The family felt stripped of dignity, their grief dissected under fluorescent lights. Meanwhile, the media latched onto the narrative. News anchors debated negligence. How could a mother leave 2 toddlers alone on a playground, even for a phone call? Headlines questioned the father's absence, whispering about possible hidden motives. Talk shows speculated on darker theories, presenting them as entertainment for late-night audiences. The parents, once victims of unthinkable loss, were recast as possible culprits in the public eye. Strangers mailed letters condemning them, accusing them of carelessness, of knowing more than they admitted. Online forums swelled with speculation. Some users convinced the parents were hiding the truth. For Yahrov, the couple, the judgment was unbearable. The mother withdrew, barely leaving the house, her guilt growing heavier with each passing day. She blamed herself openly, replaying the decision to answer the phone, wondering if those few minutes had sealed her daughter's fate. The father reacted differently, growing defensive, angry at investigators, furious at the media's intrusion. Their coping mechanisms collided, and the once solid foundation of their marriage began to crack under the weight. Conversations turned into arguments, grief turned into blame. Friends who had once rallied to their side began to pull away, unsure how to balance sympathy with suspicion. The community, fractured by fear, now watched the family with uneasy eyes. Parents who had prayed beside them at vigils now whispered in hushed voices, questioning what they might be hiding. Every time detectives returned for more questioning, the whispers grew louder. Inside the home, shadows deepened. The children's bedroom remained untouched, toys arranged as they had been on the morning they vanished. But where once those rooms held warmth, they now carried an unbearable silence. Photographs of the sisters smiled from the walls, reminders of innocence lost, and of the suspicion pressing down on those who loved them most. The family could not grieve in peace because every tear was scrutinized, every public word measured against expectations of how a real, grieving parent should behave. The investigation into the family led nowhere. Polygraphs were inconclusive but showed no deception. Phone records confirmed the mother's account. Work logs supported the father's alibi. Relatives had no motive, no opportunity. Yet despite the lack of evidence, suspicion lingered. It hung in the air around their house, seeped into conversations, poisoned relationships with neighbors. The family's name became synonymous not only with tragedy, but with unanswered questions. By the time investigators shifted focus outward again, the damage was irreversible. The search had not only failed to find the sisters, but had shattered the very foundation of the family they had been taken from. Grief and guilt had become indistinguishable, twisting their home into a place where every silence, every shadow, felt like accusation. And though no charges were filed, the family would forever carry the weight of having been suspected in the disappearance of their own children. As the months turned into years, the disappearance of the Toddler sisters became a case that refused to let go of the community's conscience. Their photographs, once plastered on telephone poles and store windows, began to yellow and curl, but the faces staring out were impossible to forget. The hotline never truly went silent. Calls came in at all hours, strangers claiming sightings, neighbors passing along rumors, even distant relatives insisting they had dreamed of the girls alive. Each call was logged, and each demanded attention, because detectives knew they could not afford to ignore even the faintest possibility. Some of the tips carried fleeting hope. A woman in a nearby town swore she had seen two children who looked just like the sisters being ushered into a white van near a grocery store. Police scrambled, interviewing witnesses, pulling grainy surveillance footage. But when they tracked the vehicle, it belonged to a family from out of state, traveling with their own children. Case closed. Another man claimed to have spotted them at a highway rest stop years later, their faces burned into his memory. Detectives chased that lead across county lines, interviewing travelers, checking security cameras. Nothing matched. Each time, the excitement of a possible break curdled into disappointment. The white van became its own phantom in the investigation. Sightings poured in from every direction, each story slightly different. Sometimes the van was rusted, other times pristine, sometimes driven by a lone man, other times with multiple passengers. The contradictions were endless, but the imagery stuck in the public imagination. Soon, people saw white vans everywhere, convinced each one could be the key. Detectives tried to separate fact from paranoia, but the noise grew louder than the signals. A reward fund, raised by donations from the community and boosted by national coverage, climbed into the tens of thousands. The promise of money brought forward a flood of new tips, many of them insincere. Callers confessed to crimes they couldn't have committed, spinning elaborate stories that unraveled under basic questioning. Some hoaxes were cruel, letters mailed anonymously, claiming knowledge of the girl's fate, only to end with demands for cash. Each one consumed hours of investigative time, resources already stretched thin. Detectives chased them all, only to return empty-handed, frustrated, and exhausted. The false confessions were perhaps the cruelest. Men in distant prisons came forward, claiming responsibility, hoping to trade information for lighter sentences. They recited details they had gleaned from news articles, then faltered when asked for specifics. Detectives became adept at spotting lies, but policy dictated that each confession be vetted. Again and again, hours were wasted, leaving investigators more jaded with every dead end. Despite the noise, the case never disappeared from public memory. Candlelight vigils were held annually at the playground, where families gathered to pray, to mourn, and to remind themselves that the sisters were not forgotten. Each vigil renewed attention, and with it came another wave of supposed leads. Detectives followed them diligently, sometimes driving hundreds of miles to interview strangers who were certain they had seen the girls. Every time, the trail dissolved. For the family, the years of tips and rumors became a twisted cycle of hope and despair. Each phone call from law enforcement carried the possibility of news, but more often than not, it brought nothing but another crushing letdown. The mother learned to recognize the officer's voice on the line, the hesitation before he admitted the lead had gone nowhere. The father grew bitter, convinced the truth would never surface. The whispers of negligence and suspicion never fully left them, and now they lived under the added weight of constant false hope. Detectives cycled through the case in shifts. New investigators inherited the thick files, diving into thousands of pages of reports, photographs, and transcripts. Each new set of eyes brought optimism, the belief that they might spot something overlooked. But as months of review turned into years of work, the same conclusion always emerged. No matter how far they chased the leads, everything circled back to the silent playground. The swing still stood there, chains squeaking in the wind, overlooking the patch of gravel where the girls had last been seen. No matter how many tips poured in, how many supposed sightings cropped up across state lines, it always came back to that spot, the place where two toddlers had vanished in plain sight, leaving behind no trace, no witnesses, no explanation. And as the years stretched on, the hope of uncovering the truth seemed to grow fainter, drowned in a sea of rumors, rewards, and dead ends. 20 years is a long time to live without answers. For the town, life pressed on. Children grew up, families moved in and out, and the playground itself was renovated, new swings installed, bright plastic slides replacing the old wooden structures. On the surface, it looked like progress, but to those who remembered, the cheerful colors could not erase what had happened there. The patch of ground where the sisters had last been seen still seemed heavier than the rest of the park, as though the weight of absence lingered in the soil. Parents brought their children to play, but few ever spoke openly about the girls. It was as if the entire community had developed a quiet pact. Don't mention it, don't linger on it, and maybe the fear won't return. The case files told a different story. Inside the police archives, dusty boxes bore the sisters' names, stuffed with reports, photographs, and transcripts of interviews that had gone nowhere. The binders had been flipped through by multiple generations of detectives, each new investigator starting with a sense of determination only to end with resignation. Over the years, leads dried up completely, tips stopped coming, and the case was formally classified as cold. It wasn't forgotten, but it was no longer active, no longer a priority. For law enforcement, it had become one haunting mystery among many others, too unsolved to close, too hollow to chase further. For the townsfolk, the story settled into folklore. New residents, hearing whispers of what had happened, treated it as a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children not to stray too far at the park, invoking the sisters' names as a chilling reminder of how quickly a moment could change everything. Teenagers dared one another to sneak into the playground at night, the story of the vanished girls taking on a ghostly edge, exaggerated and retold until it became a part of the town's mythology. But for those who had been there, the neighbors, the friends, the witnesses, the pain was not diluted by time or rumor. The memories were sharp, unyielding, and impossible to distance from the everyday lives they continued to live. No one carried the weight more than the mother. 2 decades later, she still walked to the park on quiet mornings, placing fresh flowers near the swing set. Sometimes she stood there silently, eyes fixed on the horizon as though waiting for something to change. Other times, she whispered to the air, her lips moving as though in conversation with children who had been frozen forever in her memory at the ages of 3 and 5. Neighbors who saw her gave her space, unwilling to intrude on the ritual, though her presence was a reminder that the grief had never loosened its grip. The father, by contrast, had withdrawn long ago. The years of suspicion, the endless false leads, and the crushing absence had hollowed him out. The marriage had not survived, the strain too much for two people grieving in such different ways. He moved to another part of the state, rarely speaking of the case, his silence mistaken by some as detachment, but understood by others as a survival mechanism. He carried the loss quietly, avoiding the town and its memories, but the burden never truly left him. Detectives who had once worked the case occasionally spoke of it in retirement. They admitted it was one of the most haunting files they had ever encountered. 2 children vanishing from a busy playground, dozens of people present, and yet no trace, no witness, no explanation. Some confessed to lying awake at night replaying the scene, convinced they must have missed something. Others believed it was one of those rare cases where the truth had slipped permanently into the cracks, beyond recovery. For the younger generation, the case lived on in whispers. Teenagers who hadn't even been born at the time grew up hearing about that day as though it were a campfire story. Parents spoke of it carefully, warning their children not to talk to strangers, not to run out of sight. The names of the sisters became shorthand for danger, invoked in hushed tones whenever someone wanted to remind their kids how fast safety could shatter. Yet beneath the cautionary tale, the real tragedy remained, the lives that were lived only briefly, the futures stolen before they began. As the 20th anniversary approached, local reporters revisited the story. They walked the grounds of the park, interviewing long-retired officers, neighbors now gray-haired, classmates who barely remembered their lost peers. News segments aired old footage. Crying. Parents, flashing sirens, endless search parties marching through woods. Seeing it again brought the pain rushing back for many. It wasn't just a mystery, it was a wound the community had learned to live around, but never healed. And still, through all the years and all the silence, the mother's flowers never stopped appearing at the swing set. The blooms wilted and were replaced, season after season, year after year. For passers-by, it was the most visible reminder that the case was not over, not truly. The girls were still missing, their story unresolved. Time had boxed their files away, but it had not boxed away the grief. And every time a new parent glanced uneasily at the swings, every time the flowers appeared again, it was a quiet signal that some questions refused to die, no matter how many years have passed. It was a quiet afternoon, 2 decades after the sisters had vanished, the kind of day where the playground was dotted with children too young to know its history. Parents chatted on benches, their voices carrying over the steady creak of swings. A local family had brought their dog, a restless shepherd mix who pulled at its leash with impatient energy. When the children grew tired of running and the parents settled into small talk, the dog was given freedom to roam the edges of the park. It circled the lot, sniffing at tree roots, darting at shadows, before its attention locked onto a familiar corner, the patch of ground beneath the swings. At first, the owners thought nothing of it. Dogs dug instinctively, chasing scents invisible to human senses. But this digging was different. The animal's claws tore at the soil with frantic urgency, dirt flying in every direction as it refused to be called back. Parents frowned, some annoyed, others uneasy. The owners moved to restrain the dog, tugging at its collar, but by then it had already unearthed something. A small scrap of faded fabric, clinging to damp soil, clutched tightly between its teeth. And then, as the hole deepened, something harder surfaced, something pale and fragile. The playground, once alive with chatter, fell silent as whispers rippled across the swings and slides. Someone recognized the shape immediately and shouted for the police. Within minutes, officers arrived, their faces grim as they took in the scene. The area was cordoned off with tape, parents ushered away, children carried home. The dog stood restless, its discovery already changing everything. Beneath the packed earth of a public park, In the shadow of a swing set where countless children had played over the years, fragments of bone had been found. Detectives who had worked the original case were notified, some now gray-haired, some long retired but still living with the weight of unanswered questions. They returned to the park that night, standing beneath floodlights as crime scene technicians worked methodically. The soil was sifted, every clump of dirt examined. More fragments were uncovered. Small bones, unmistakably human. Each was carefully sealed in evidence bags, labeled with the date and the case number that had haunted the town for 20 years. Forensics moved quickly. Initial analysis confirmed the fragments belonged to a child, and the presence of fabric suggested clothing buried alongside. DNA testing was rushed, and within weeks the results were delivered. The remains belonged to one of the missing sisters. After 2 decades of silence, there was now proof that at least one of the girls had never left the playground. She had been there the entire time, buried beneath the very place where searchers had once combed tirelessly, where dogs had circled but never alerted, where neighbors had kept watch in vain. The revelation stunned the community. News outlets swarmed, broadcasting live from the park, their cameras aimed at the swings that now carried a grim new meaning. Parents wept openly, horrified that their children had been playing for years over the hidden grave of another. Detectives were shaken, realizing how close they had once been to answers, and how a single overlooked patch of ground had hidden the truth for decades. But along with answers came new questions. How had the remains ended up buried so deep under the swing set? Soil analysis suggested they had been in place for nearly as long as the sisters had been missing. That meant the burial likely happened around the time of the disappearance. Yet the original searches had been exhaustive. The ground had been checked, sifted, even dug in some areas. How could investigators have missed it? And more chilling still, who had the opportunity to bury the body there in plain sight without anyone noticing? The discovery reignited every theory. Some believed the abductor had hidden the body during the chaos of the initial search, knowing officers' attention was scattered. Others argued the burial must have occurred later, that someone had returned under cover of night, concealing the remains where no one would think to look. Neither explanation sat comfortably. Both suggested a disturbing level of planning and boldness. The mother, now older, received the news with both devastation and grim relief. For years she had laid flowers at that playground, never realizing how close she truly was to one of her daughters. Now she knew, at least in part, where one child had been all along. Yet the knowledge offered little comfort, because the second sister was still unaccounted for. The family's torment shifted, but did not ease. Detectives reopened the case in full, combing through old files with renewed urgency. Every suspect was revisited, every interview re-examined, but the same dead ends loomed. The handyman who had once been suspected was long gone, his trail cold. Witnesses' memories had faded, blurred by time. The town's silence, once protective, now felt complicit. And though one girl had finally been found, her discovery left the central mystery more unsettling than ever. The swings swayed slightly in the summer air, their chains rattling faintly. Beneath them, crime scene tape fluttered as if marking a scar. After 2 decades, the park had given up one of its secrets, but it had not delivered justice. Instead, it had exposed a chilling truth that the answers had been hidden in plain sight, buried beneath the laughter of children and the silence of time. And with only one sister found, the haunting question remained: where was the other? The discovery of the remains sent a tremor through every level of the investigation. Detectives who had been young officers during the original search now returned, older and heavier, with the weight of decades, standing again in the very park they had once combed in frantic desperation. What stunned them most was not simply that the remains were found, but where they were found, buried beneath a swing set in one of the most visible and well-trodden areas of the playground. The question was immediate and unavoidable. How could investigators, volunteers, and even trained dogs have missed this 20 years earlier? Forensics teams moved carefully, taking soil samples from multiple depths around the site. Their findings suggested the burial had occurred near the time of the disappearance, the soil compacted and layered in a way that indicated long, undisturbed rest. If accurate, this meant the child had been hidden there from the very beginning, while helicopters circled overhead and hundreds of searchers combed the woods just steps away. It was a chilling thought that the answer had been beneath their feet all along. Theories splintered quickly. One camp believed it was a crime of opportunity, carried out in the brief window between the children's disappearance and the first wave of responders. In that theory, someone had lured or taken the girls, harmed one, and buried her quickly in a shallow grave beneath loose soil. With the chaos of the initial search, neighbors running, police rushing, parents screaming, it was possible that no one had noticed, but that explanation had its flaws. The burial was not shallow. The remains were found deep enough to suggest deliberate effort. Digging to such a depth would have taken time, far more than a few frantic minutes. Could someone really have accomplished that in broad daylight, in the middle of a crowded park, without being seen? Others believed the body had been placed there later, that perhaps the killer had hidden the girls elsewhere at first, only to return under cover of night once the search parties had dispersed. Maybe even days later, while the investigation had shifted outward to highways and distant towns, someone slipped into the park and buried her directly beneath the swings, betting on the unlikelihood that anyone would think to dig there again. The boldness of that theory disturbed detectives deeply. It suggested a killer confident enough to return to the very scene of the abduction, certain he would not be caught. The families of the victims were tormented by the possibilities. The mother, who had spent years placing flowers at the park, now grappled with the unbearable thought that she had been standing just feet above her daughter's hidden grave. The father, distant but still tied to the case by blood and memory, raged at the investigators. He demanded to know how they could have missed it, how so many people could have walked across that soil and failed to uncover the truth. Detectives had no answers that could satisfy. The reality was as painful for them as it was for the family, because it meant that 20 years of searching, of chasing tips and suspects across state lines, might have been unnecessary had the ground been more carefully examined in the beginning. The forensic anthropologists delivered their analysis in sober tones. The condition of the bones, the soil composition, the fragment of fabric, all pointed to a burial that had remained undisturbed since the time of the abduction. No signs of later disturbance, no evidence that the grave had been reopened. This supported the theory of an immediate burial. And yet, the logistics still made little sense. Who would dare? Who had the time, the tools, and the audacity to dig in the very heart of the park while police and parents were so close by? Detectives revisited old suspects with fresh eyes. The handyman who had once been questioned now looked even more suspicious, his access to tools and familiarity with the park making him a plausible candidate. Others in the town, once considered harmless, were reconsidered. A neighbor who had claimed to be home all day, a passerby whose description never matched anyone confirmed. Suddenly, every detail seemed worth pulling apart again. But years had eroded evidence, blurred memories, and scattered witnesses. Alibis were old, suspects long moved or deceased. The investigation was both reignited and paralyzed by the enormity of what they had overlooked. Theories spread beyond the official investigation, too. In town, residents argued in hushed voices. Some believed the killer had been one of their own, someone who lived among them all these years. Others clung to the idea of a transient stranger, someone who passed through, committed the crime, and vanished again into anonymity. Both explanations carried fear. If it was a local, it meant a neighbor had been capable of unimaginable cruelty. If it was an outsider, it meant no one was safe from a predator who could strike and disappear without leaving a trace. What unsettled everyone most was the silence of the second sister. If one had been buried beneath the swings, where was the other? The discovery answered one question, but created many more, each one sharper, heavier, and more impossible to resolve. Forensics could confirm what had happened to one child, but the fate of the other remained cloaked in the same darkness that had swallowed the case from the beginning. And as investigators left the playground that night, the swing set loomed above the taped-off soil like a cruel monument. They knew the case was no longer just about finding answers. It was about facing the haunting truth that sometimes evil hides in plain sight, daring everyone to miss it. And for 20 years, they had. The DNA results arrived with a heavy finality that no one could soften. Forensic analysts confirmed what investigators already suspected. The remains beneath the swing set belonged to the younger of the two sisters. It was an answer, but only half of one. For the mother, now aged and weathered by 20 years of grief, the confirmation was both devastating and oddly numbing. She had always believed her children would be found together, whether in life or in death. To learn that only one had been recovered tore open a wound that had never truly healed. One daughter's fate was known, but the other was still lost, her absence echoing even louder than before. Police held a press conference, standing before reporters with somber expressions. They admitted what many already feared. No new suspects had emerged, no fresh evidence had surfaced. The site itself had yielded nothing beyond the bones in the fabric. No fingerprints, no tools, no trace of who had been responsible. The soil had preserved the remains but erased every other clue. Detectives acknowledged that the burial likely occurred in the chaotic hours of the first search, when volunteers and officers rushed frantically across the park. In that confusion, the shallow disturbance in the earth had been overlooked. The admission was painful, not only for the family, but also for the investigators, who were forced to concede that the truth had been under their feet all along. The mother listened to the press conference on television from her living room, the sound of reporters' questions blending into background noise. She had no energy left for anger at the police, though others in the community raged on her behalf. Instead, she sat quietly with her daughter's photograph in her lap, tears slipping down her cheeks as she traced the frame with trembling hands. For her, closure was not a word that carried meaning. What had been returned to her was not enough, and what was missing left her more hollow than before. The father, long estranged and living in another part of the state, received the news with equal devastation. He declined to speak publicly, though relatives described him as haunted by the idea that his daughters had been split apart in death. He had once held hope that both might still be alive, but that fragile dream was gone. Now he lived with the reality that only one had been accounted for, and that the other's fate remained suspended in silence. The town responded with a mix of sorrow and unease. Vigils were held once more, candles flickering at the playground as neighbors gathered to mourn. But beneath the prayers, there was discomfort. The idea that a child's remains had lain buried under the swing set for 20 years unsettled everyone who had ever brought their children to play there. Parents confessed to feeling sick, knowing their own children had climbed and laughed just feet above a grave. The playground, already a site of whispered caution, now felt like hallowed ground. Investigators revisited every angle, every suspect, but time had eroded too much. Witnesses could barely recall details from that summer day, their memories blurred by decades of retelling. Old suspects were either dead, moved far away, or had airtight alibis that held up even after years of scrutiny. The handyman who had once drawn suspicion was long gone, his trail lost. Theories of trafficking, opportunistic abduction, or a local predator all resurfaced, but none could be proven. The file was reopened, but remained stubbornly empty of new breakthroughs. For the mother, the grief became ritual. She continued to leave flowers at the park, only now she placed them directly beneath the swing set, at the spot where the grave had been uncovered. She whispered her daughter's name into the air, though her prayers always included both children. One had been found, but she refused to separate them in her heart. She believed that wherever the missing sister was, she could still hear. The flowers were not just for the one recovered, but for the one who remained missing. The swings creaked in the wind as they always had, a sound that once signaled joy, but now carried only sorrow. Parents who passed by held their children closer, some choosing to avoid the playground altogether. The once vibrant heart of the community was now a scar, a reminder of how innocence could be stolen in an instant and how some questions never found their answers. The final truth was both simple and unbearable. One sister's fate had been uncovered, but the other remained unknown. No one could say whether she had been taken far away, whether she had suffered the same fate and lay buried elsewhere, or whether her story would ever be discovered. The case remained open, frozen in limbo between tragedy and mystery. And so, the park lived on, the swings swaying idly as seasons changed. To strangers, it was just another playground. To those who knew the story, it was a graveyard of memory. And every time the chains rattled and the wind pushed the empty seats back and forth, it was as though the park itself whispered the haunting truth, that only half the story had been told and the other half may never be known.